Hi guys, I'm going to show you over video how I specifically formulated this problem. Instead of narrating the whole thing, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just talk about line by line my actual formulation and tell you how I got to the information, or basically tell you where I got pieces of information from the narrative, because this narrative is extremely long. Okay, so this is an investment problem. And in this particular investment problem, you are given a certain maximum amount to invest, which is in this case $800,000. You're also given the maximum risk index for the client, which is 0.05. And because it's an investment problem, we want to maximize our returns. So basically, you want to maximize the return based on these two constraints for the client and other constraints on how the portfolio has to be, or the certain funds in the portfolio have to be invested. So in this case, here are my decision variables. G, the amount invested in growth fund stock. I, the amount invested in income fund. And M, invested in the money market fund, which is the pieces of information here that I'm highlighting. Okay, so that's how I figured out decision variables. All right, so your objective, like I mentioned, is to maximize the annual yield, or your annual return on investment. And how I got these particular values, I believe, is right here. So the yield for growth is 18%, the yield for income is 12.5, and the yield for money market fund is 7.5%. So you obviously have to translate that into not a percent, but as a decimal in order to be able to calculate the the annual yield. All right, so here are the constraints. So here's first constraint. You can't invest more than $800,000 because that's how much the client has. So that means that G plus I plus M has to be less than or equal to $800,000. Pretty easy. All right. Second constraint is the amount invested in the growth stock. All right. So this is how I formulated it. I formulated it as one line, but just because I prefer to do it that way. But this will translate into two pieces of information because there's both a minimum and a maximum. And I got that information up here. So general guidelines indicate that the amount invested in the growth fund must be 20 to 40% of the total portfolio value. And what is the total portfolio value? It's adding these amounts, G plus I plus M. So that means at least 20% of your investment in growth stock has to be 20% of the overall total investment, but it has to be less than or equal to 40% of the total investment. And it cuts up into two pieces of information when you enter it into solvers. So G has to be more than or equal to 20% of G plus I plus M, but also has to be less than or equal to 40% of G plus I plus M. All right. So next piece, income fund investment amount. In this case, that information is here. Similar percentages with the other two funds stipulate between 20 to 50% of the total portfolio value must be an income fund. Okay. Again, I kind of written it out the same way. So 20% of the sum of G plus I plus M has to be less than or equal to I, but that also has to be less than or equal to 50% of G plus I plus M. And again, that cuts up that does parse out into two pieces of information that you have to enter into solver. So the amount investment in the income fund has to be more than 20% of the total, but it has to be less than or equal to 50% of the total. Okay. Next constraint is the money market fund investment amount. In this problem, it only declared a minimum. It has to be 30% of the total amount invested. So, and here is that piece of information. At least 30% of the total portfolio value must be in the money market fund. Cool. Awesome. All right. So the last constraint is that tricky risk tolerance. All right. So we know what the value has to be. It has to be less than or equal to 0.05 because that's what the client wants. So here, based on evaluation of the client's risk tolerance, Williams assigned a maximum risk index of 0.05 for the client. So that's how you know what your limit is. The weights, the best way I can talk about a weighted average is in terms of grades. So, and that's the most common application. So I'm just gonna chat it and type it out here. So let's say homework is 25% of your grade, quizzes is 30% of your grade, and exams are 45% of your grade. You have to make sure your weights do add up to 100%. In this case, that in this little example, that is the case. And what that means is, let's say you got 100% of homework. Regardless of whether or not you did excellently, it's still only worth 25% of your grade. So let's say in this case, I got 100% of my homeworks, but on my quizzes, I only got a 90%, and in exams, let's say I only got a 96%. Now, in order for me to calculate the weight of, let's say, of my homework, quizzes, and exams on my overall grade, I have to multiply these two values. So weighted amount for homework is 25% multiplied by 100%. The weighted grade, the weighted amount for quizzes is 30% times 90, which the grade that I got, which is 90%. And then the weighted amount for exams is 45% times 96%. And then what you do is after you make these calculations, you have to add them up. And if you do, the grade that I end up getting is 95.2%. So that is the concept of what a weighted average is. Now, in this particular case, what the problem says, these weights right here, these weights are calculated by the percentage of how much you've actually invested in each fund. So for example, if you've invested 30%, or let's just make it easy, let's say you've invested 25% of your overall fund in these G funds, in these growth funds, that's going to be your weight. And what you do is you multiply the weight times the risk factor, which is for growth funds, it's 0.01, then you add them up. And this is how I got to this particular formulation. So in order to take what the percentage of your growth fund is of your overall investment, you have to divide that by the sum total of what's been invested in growth and in growth and income and money market funds, and then multiply it by the risk factor. So that's how I calculated risk tolerance. And then obviously you have to make sure that you include you have to make sure that all of your variables are more than and equal to 0, so that way you're not getting negative values. So that's how I formulated this particular problem. In the next video, I'm going to go ahead and talk about how I entered this into Solver and something really tricky that I found that was causing errors.